any way you can put up a link on the announcements for Friday's class?
Funny you should mention that. I was about to bring that up.
Oh,
Let me do
well,
it.
I'll wait then.
Okay, let me do my attendance here. As far as who's physically here, Aki is not here, Boggs is not here, Bonner is not here, Clay is not here, Dawson is not here, Ellis is not here, Castro is not here, Green is not here, Harrison is here, NWVSU here. Same with Vincent. James is not here, Kesterson is also here, WVSU here. King is not here, Lewis is not here, Linda Q is not here, Wilson is not here, Grace is not here, Ward is not here, Wilcox is not here, Wilder? Nope, Wilder's not here, Parks is not here, Dawson came in, so Dawson is here, and so is Cash Paula. And if you're online, just do the normal thing and send me your words, the attendance words. It's not officially starting yet, so I won't give you the most important reminders and updates like the one you just asked about. But some other ones, let me beat a dead horse here. You're running out of time to do independent work, so now's the time to start trying to get in. It's a full letter grade. I should help you, because if you're a student who doesn't do good with testing or things like that, that's 100 points. That can boost your grade, right? So take advantage of it. And as the ones who have started turning things in, I'm a little bit picky because that's one of the things you should be good at after you graduate college is being a good written, communicator, using written communication. So I'm picky. So if all of you, not all of you, it seems I would predict that most of you are going to wait till like the last weekend to turn stuff in. And I'm going to be even pickier then because I just don't have time to grade. Think about that. That's 10, in theory, 10 pages per person. And I'd estimate about 20 of you still need to turn stuff in. That's 200 pages. I don't have time for that. So if you mess it up, I'm just going to send back like that's 0. Now, for those of you who've already started turning stuff in, you know how I usually do it, at least at first. If you mess it up, I turn it back in and say, I can't grade this, you'll need to change it, and then I'll grade it, right? But if you wait to the last minute, I just don't have time to do it. So at least do something this weekend, turn it in so you can see how I grade. Even if it's a short paper, turn it in, see how I grade, and then you can plan ahead, like, oh man, that's how it grades. I need to think about that between now and the end of the class. And we only have 2 weeks left. We've got next week, which is the week off, and I'll get you in a second, and then the week after that, which is the last week of class, and that's when the papers are due. And then, of course, the week after that, we have finals. Yes, sir.
So what if I have like a question, like say 10 questions a day, but I send like 10 different emails?
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That should be 10 points though. That
Exactly. Yeah. So in case you guys didn't hear online, that's a great question. You can either write papers, and then then your points are based on how long your paper is, and also how good your paper is, but mostly how long it is. Or like I keep presenting these questions, you can just send an email. It's like, you asked this question, or I thought of this question. I looked it up. Here's the answer. Here's the source that gave that answer. And that's just automatic 1 point. Because that's easier. You don't have to worry about plagiarism. Like you can literally just copy and paste your source and say, this is the answer. And when you write a paper, you do have to worry about plagiarism. You have to write it in your own words. You can't reword what's been written in your source. You actually have to summarize it in your own words. So, but yeah, great question. Now, I also had another question, and I was going to bring this up anyway. We're supposed to get some snow tomorrow something. It's probably not going to be much. But like I always say, if you don't have a plan B, you need a plan B, right? So the plan B, if the snow's too bad, first of all, check your emails before you come in. If I'm snowed in, I'm going to email you and say, hey, I can't come in. We're going to meet online only. Likewise, as always, if you just don't want to come in because you're snowed in, you can meet us online. And I will post a link because someone asked about that, but it's the same link we always use. So if for some reason I have a brain fart, forget to post the link, just look back in the old announcements. It's the same link we always use. But yeah, I should remember to do that. So any questions about the plan B for snow days? We will still meet, but it'll be online only. And again, if you're going to come in on Friday, make sure you check your email first. Because like I said, if I can't make it, I'll post an email at least by 7 a.m. So if you check your emails at, 7:20 and you don't see an email from me, then you should know that I am coming in. Any questions about that?
I gotta catch a bus at 6:30.
Yeah, well, shoot.
Can you get up a little earlier?
I'm up by then, yeah. So I'll know, yeah, sure. But yeah, so actually let's see, I'm up at 6, so, yeah. If you don't get the email by 6:30, then yeah.
Okay.
Or if you check your emails at 6:30, if you didn't see that, get an email from me saying I'm not coming in, then I will be here.
The only problem is I live on a back street and it's up a hill,
All
and
right.
that scooter.
Oh, yeah,
Don't
yeah,
have
so feel free to
brakes.
just join us online, you don't have to come in, especially in that situation. All right, so the opposite of that, and this is new information, so 2 weeks from today, so our second to last day of class, we will not have online class, and I will not record it, and you will not get any points unless you're here. So 2 weeks from today, the last Wednesday of the course, you have to be here. And not only do you have to be here and you'll get 0 points if you're not here, but for those of you who are here, you'll get extra credit points. Because we have to do course evaluations. So someone's gonna be here to give you the little things that you can fill out, tell them what a jerk I am or whatever. But yeah, so again, you'll be marked absent, you won't get your extra credit points if you don't show up 2 weeks from today. And also, for those of you who do show up, you'll get double the extra credit points. So it's like punishment, I hate to use the word punishment, but sort of a punishment if you don't come and extra reward if you do come. So any questions about stuff in general? Oh yeah, and then again, lab today, we're not meeting in person because it's completely online. I'll be online from 10 to 11:50 as the usual lab hours. So if you need my help, you can meet me online. And if you don't remember the link to meet me online, send me an email and I'll answer. Because that's one of the things anyway, like even if you were here doing the lab and you needed my help, I would have to come behind you, like looking at your computer and breathing down your neck or something. We don't need that, right? So if it's all online anyway, it'll be best for us to meet online. No need to show up today, I won't be here. I mean, I'll be in my office, but I won't be in here. Any questions about that? All right, let's jump back into it then. The first word for attendance today is peanut butter fudge. Today is National Peanut Butter Fudge Day. All right, anyway, so we're talking about an overview of population ecology. We talked about population density, which was a pretty simple concept, right? But probably the only new stuff you learned in that was the different ways that scientists measure population density, right? Because it's not like you go out and count every single individual. Then we talked about population age structure, which is basically like, in a non-scientific way of describing it, you would say something like, oh yeah, West Virginia has more older people than, per capita than most other states, right? That would be talking about population age structure. Now, we're talking about something that's sort of related to population age structure, which is life tables and survivorship curves. This is where it gets a little bit more difficult, but not much. So first thing we're talking about is life tables. Life tables track survivorship. You need to know that. Actually, let me think about this. Now that I think about it, all right, so there's probably not going to be any questions about life tables on the exam, but let's talk about it anyway. Like I said, they track survivorship. What is survivorship? That is the chance of an individual in a given population surviving to various ages. So the example I'm about to give you on the next slide is a life table for humans, which is a good example in a way because we're all familiar with humans and we all pretty much know how life history, you probably already know the survivorship of humans. Like, what do you think? Do you think your chances of going from 20 to 30 are like going from the decades of when you're in your 20s to your 30s? Do you think your chances are higher of doing that, or do you think your chances are higher of going from your 70s to your 80s? Like, let's say are you in your 20s? Yeah, all right. Let's say I'll ask you this way. Let's get specific. Do you think I'll even use me as an example because I'm in my 40s. Do you think his chances of hitting the 30s are higher or lower than my chances of hitting the 50s? Higher, right? We just kind of know this, right? This is pretty intuitive for humans. So that'll be the example I'll give you on the next slide. But again, in some ways, humans are bad examples for this because humans don't exactly live like most natural organisms. But anyway, life tables also help to determine the most vulnerable stages of the life cycle. So here we go again. Like I said, this is the life table for humans, right? So you can see here, like your chances are really high of getting from your 10s or your 0s to your 10s and your 10s to your 20s. You can see how your chances, let's see, go up, down a little bit, up, then down a little bit, down a little bit, down a little bit, down a lot. See, you can see, imagine if you were to graph your chances, you can see then like how your chances really are, basically. And again, from humans, we already know this, so I'm not teaching anything new here. And also, nobody put a big old X to here. I'm definitely not going to ask you any questions like, you don't have to study that. Like, I'm not just going to ask you some questions like, what are the chances of a 30 to 40-year-old making it to their 40 to 50s, right? And the correct answer would be 0.973, but again, I'm not going to ask you that. There's nothing to memorize here. If anything, and I'm probably not going to do this either, if anything, I would give you something like this and ask you a question about it so you could just decipher it. What are the chances of somebody being born making it to their 10th birthday? Chance, and you look at the chart and say, oh, the chances are 0.992. Or, in other words, 99.2%. But again, this is a human example. Like I said earlier, back this up a second. It helps to determine the most vulnerable stages of the life cycle. So you can see, obviously, as we already know, like when you get older, right, once you hit a certain age, your chances of surviving to the next decade go down a little bit, and the older you get, the more drastic it drops off. But you already know that. So for us, that's common sense. But it's not like that for all animals. In some animals, their chances of dying young, unlike us, are a lot higher. And if they survive being old or survive getting past being young, then their chances are a lot higher. So it all depends on the organism. And going back to what we talked about on Monday, the reason that's important would be for things like fisheries, right? So again, the government controls how much. If you think about commercial fishing, they say, all right, you can fish from this month to this month, and you're allowed to catch this many pounds of fish, and the fish have to be this big when you catch them. All these different rules, and that's part of how they do that, because they determine when the most vulnerable life stages are for those species, and then make the rules accordingly. Anyway, any questions about the life table? Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is this: the survivorship curves. I don't have any room. Hope they don't mind me graphing this or erasing this. Hopefully, if you're online, you can see me. If not, it's not that big of a deal. Like I was mentioning earlier when I was talking about this, I said, imagine if you graphed it. So if I said, that's hard to see. But if I put this time in years, actually decades, time in decades, and then, I don't know, percent chance of survivorship, you can see again, it starts really high, right? To like 99.2%. And then it actually goes up a little bit at first, then it starts slowly going down, then it really starts going down, right? Could you imagine this graph based on those numbers? Make sense? If you were to graph those numbers, right? So a decade from 0 to 10, you're at 99.2%, right? And then at 10 to 20, you're right here at 99.6%. Does that make sense? Every year, I'm graphing that percentage. And this is going down, 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 right? So survivorship curve is basically just graphing that. Survivorship curve. It plots the individuals that are still alive at each age in the maximum lifespan. That's your book definition. I'm not going to ask you the definition. There's 3 different survivorship types. I'm going to teach you that on the next slide, and that's what you're going to need to know for the exam, is to differentiate between the 3 types. So don't feel like you need to memorize the definition, which is good because I don't like this definition. I think my definition is easier. My definition is a survivorship curve is basically the graph of what I just showed you back here, which was the life table, right? It's a graph of this information on the right. It's graphing these numbers on your y-axis and these numbers on your x-axis. That's basically what it is. However, because, I don't know how to put this, it uses percentages and not actual ages, right? So when I made my graph, I did actually use actual ages. Right, because that survivorship table I just showed you had it in decades, so 10, 20, 30, 40, right? So in my example, I used actual ages because it was just an example. Though for real survivorship curves, they don't use actual ages, they use percentages of lifespans. So once again, according to this life table, the human lifespan is 90 plus, right? So I wouldn't write 0 to 10, 10 to 20. It would just be like, this would be 0% of the lifespan, right? Because that's the beginning. This would be 100% of the lifespan. This would be 50% of the lifespan because that's right in the middle. Let's talk about why we do that though. It's because we can then compare species that have different lifespans, right? So if I did this graph right here again, where it shows 10 to, all the way to 90 years old for humans, and then if I tried to graph the same thing for a dandelion, a dandelion only lives 1 year, right? So then I would have this little bitty graph, this little line right there. That would make no sense, right? This will make more sense when I show you a picture. But when we use percentages, then we can graph different species. For example, humans and squirrels and oysters, right? Oysters don't live to be as long as humans. What we're saying is this is the entire lifespan. From here, this is the beginning of the lifespan. This is the end of the lifespan. Whether it be like 90 years for a human or, 5 years for an oyster. I don't know how long oysters live, but that's just an example. Does that make sense? You can see again, on the x-axis, we're not doing actual years. We're doing percentage of the lifespan. Does that part make sense? All right, and again, this is why we use this. We can compare different species. Now, as far as the exam is concerned, what I'm about to tell you is now more important. Everything else was less important. What I'm about to tell you is more important. You're going to need to know the difference between a type 1 survivorship curve, type 2 survivorship curve, and a type 3 survivorship curve. The next slide I'm going to show you describes it in words. But really quick, before I show you that, I'll just describe it here in these pictures. A type 1 survivorship curve is where something has a really good chance of surviving. Like when it's young, the chances of surviving from 1 decade to the next, or for humans, decade, right? It's very high. And then as you get older, the older you get, then your chances of surviving start dropping, right? That's type 1 survivorship. So your chances of surviving childhood, very high. The opposite is true of type 3. Your chances of getting past I hate to say childhood because, they're not children. Oysters aren't children, but you know what I mean, right? When they're babies. Or if we're talking about plants, when they're seeds. Your chances of growing to be an adult are very slim. But if you do make it, once you get to that adulthood, then your chances of surviving are pretty much even, right? So you're basically what this is saying is for type 1, your chances of dying are usually in old age. For type 2, type 3, your chances of dying are usually at the beginning of your life. Type 2 is kind of in between. Your chances of surviving or dying, however you want to put it, are pretty much equal throughout your lifestyle, right, or your lifespan. So there is no particularly vulnerable age for type 2. So once again, type 1, the vulnerability area is towards the end of your lifespan. Type 3, you're vulnerable in the beginning of your lifespan. And type 2, it's nice and even throughout. Which brings up a good independent work question. So these examples I just gave you for type 1 is a human, type 2 is a squirrel, type 3 is an oyster. So for independent work, you can just send me an email and say, I looked it up, and a different example for type 1 is blank, and then give me the source and tell me the example that they used. A different example for a type 2 survivorship curve is blank, and give me the source that told you that. A different example for a type 3 survivorship is blank, and then give me the source that gave you that. But be specific, because let me give you a non-specific example to help you understand type 3 one more time, and then we'll move forward. So a non-specific example for type 3 would be trees, right? So you can't use trees, and you wouldn't want to anyway. Give me something a little bit more specific, like a species of a tree, or even a genus.
Like a sycamore?
Good example, yeah. Assuming sycamores fall into there, yeah. But again, you're going to look it up and say, an example of a type 3 survivorship curve. But anyway, the reason trees are a good example is think about, you have this big old tree and then just dropping seeds everywhere, right? Think about how many hundreds, if not thousands of seeds one tree drops. Most of those seeds are not going to become a tree. And when you think about it, and people probably don't think about it this way, seeds are baby trees. They're like little embryos, just like we have embryos, that's what a seed is. It's a baby tree. Most of them don't make it. They're washed away down the sewer, or they're burnt in a fire, or they're eaten by an animal, or crushed on a road, right? Most baby trees, if you want to call that, most people think baby trees are saplings. But technically, the seeds are baby trees. So this is why trees would be a good example for a type 3. Because most of the young, aka the seeds, don't make it. And that's also just so you know why oysters are like that for a type 3. It's not that there's little baby oysters out there dying. It's just that when oysters have sex, sexually reproduce, they just put out their eggs out into the water. And those eggs, in a sense, as far as this is concerned, are baby oysters. And most of the eggs don't make it, right? But the few that do make it, once they get past that stage, they're usually okay. All right, so any questions about this slide, this picture, before I go to this next slide, which basically tells you everything I told you, but in writing instead of visually. All right, so here we go. Everything I just said, but in writing. Type 1 survivorship. Oh yeah, there's some additional information here too. So I just scratched the surface, but type 1 survivorship is where they produce very few or relatively few offspring that give good care to those offspring, and therefore there's an increasingly likelihood that those that they'll survive to maturity. So yes, that last part you already knew. That part I explained thoroughly, right? There's a likelihood they'll survive to maturity, right? So in other words, the young are not born. That part you already knew. Now I'm giving you a little bit more information. The reason is because type 1 produce relatively few offspring. Like think about, I hate to give another example because that's one more you can't look up, but I'm going to anyway. Type 1, like the opposite of this would be, have you guys ever seen those nature shows where there's like sea turtles and they come in on the beach, they dig a hole and they drop their eggs and they leave, and that's it, right? They don't come back. The mama of the sea turtle never comes back. They're like, here's a bunch of eggs, I'm gonna bury it and I'm out of here. And then when the things are born or hatched, then they've got to crawl out of the sand, make their way to the water, and then hope they survive. But and if you see a good documentary, those little baby sea turtles are getting eaten by birds and larger fish, right? It's really unlikely that they're going to survive to maturity, right? Because those sea turtles, first of all, they're not producing relatively few offspring. They're producing just a bunch of eggs. And they're certainly not giving good care. They're not giving good care at all. I mean, that's not necessarily true. They gave care by producing the eggs, but once they produced the eggs, they were gone, right? So does that make sense? You understand what I mean by produce relatively few offspring and give good care? All right. Again, type 3 is the opposite of that. Actually, I need to fix that slide. It shouldn't say low survivorship. It should say low survivorship for the young, followed by a period when survivorship is high for the few who live to a certain age. So again, type 3 is just the opposite of type 1. As a matter of fact, now that I'm thinking about it, I should add more information to this. Knowing that type 3 is the opposite of type 1, even though this information isn't on here for type 3, let me ask you this. Do you think type 3 produces few offspring or produces many offspring? Because I put it on there for some reason. I didn't put it on here. So we know type 1 produces few offspring. Do you think type 3 produces few or many offspring? Don't overthink it. Type 3 is the opposite of type 1, so what would it be?
That would be many.
Many, thank you, yes. If type 1 produces many offspring, type 1 produces few offspring, type 3 produces many. Likewise, here I explained that type 1 gives good care, and I didn't say anything about that on type 3. So what do you think? You think type 3 gives good care or gives no care?
No care.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. So remember that stuff, right? So type 1 and type 3 are opposites. And if hopefully you can remember, because this is, we're humans, right? So everything's human-centric. Of course, we're going to call humans, this type 1 because that's the type we are, right? So we're going to call it that type 1. If you can remember that humans are type 1, and remember that we produce relatively few offspring, and we give relatively good care, and that you're likely to survive to maturity, if you remember that that's type 1, hopefully it'll be easy to remember that type 3 is just the opposite. And then once you have that memorized, it should be easy to memorize the fact that type 2 is just in between type 1 and type 3, right? It's not, it's right, everything's just equal, right? It's intermediate. Survivorship is constant over the lifespan. And they probably produce, depending on the species, not necessarily few offspring, not necessarily a lot of offspring, somewhere in between. Depending on the species, they don't necessarily get good care, they don't necessarily get bad care, it's somewhere in between. So any questions about this slide?
The human being the woman has eggs, and she's born with a certain amount of eggs. And is there any way to count how many she has? I mean, we used to have families that was like 12 and the kids born at one time in the family, not at one time, but over a period. And nowadays we're down to just like 1 or 2 children per family.
We'll actually talk about that in the next chapter too. There's a reason for that. There's a social, not even a biological reason. There's a biological, it's a social reason why humans did that. Yeah, so it wasn't anything biologically that changed that caused humans to have smaller litters, if you want to call it that, smaller numbers of kids. But yeah, so that's a great question, and we will talk about it.
All right, I'll wait.
Yeah, but again, just remember type 1, just try to think about what a typical human is, and then just remember that that's type 1. And then, of course, you've got type 3 is the opposite, type 2 is the in between. All right, so now let's talk about this evolutionarily. We're going to talk about life history traits as adaptations, like why do they have that? So the life history, this is something you might need to know for the exam, is the set of traits that set the schedule of reproduction and survival. So when scientists, population ecologists are talking about the life history of an organism, they think about this too. Let me back it up a step. When you think about like a species, and there's people studying the species, it all depends on what kind of scientist they are, depending on what they're studying, right? A geneticist is going to look at the genome of the species. And here we have a population ecologist is going to be concerned with the life history. The life history talks about the reproduction and survival. So if we're talking about humans, that would be things like, all right, they typically die at this age, they typically reach sexual maturity at this age, they typically have this many kids every time they have kids, they typically have kids this far apart. Of course, humans are, again, a bad example because, like he said, even amongst humans from 100 years ago to today, times have changed, right? So our life history would change, but that wasn't because of biology, that was because of sociology. But think about a different example, and if you want to, you can write a short paper about that for independent work. Choose any organism you want and just write a quick paper about the life history. Or if you don't want to write a paper, just look it up, copy it, paste it into an email, and get you 1 point. But so for the life history of a dog, for example, you might say, a dog, and I don't know the answer to this, a dog reaches sexual maturity at whatever age, and then when they reproduce, they have an average of however many puppies, and then they have, they don't have another litter until however long it is, right? And then you talk about how many litters they have on average before they die, stuff like that. Does that make sense? Life history. So we're talking about from birth to death of a typical organism of that species, when they reproduce, how often they reproduce, how many organisms they produce when they reproduce, all those kinds of things. So all the stuff we just talked about, which was the survivorship curve, this is where it all mingles in together. That's an important feature of its life history, according to your textbook. I mean, I might rewrite that and say something like the population's pattern of survivorship, which is what I just showed you, type 1, type 2, or type 3, is due to its life history. That's, I don't know, you could argue, you could say those either way. Anyway, so again, like I said up here, kind of reiterating it right here, when we're talking about reproduction and survival, specifically key life history traits. And again, these are key life history traits. There's also other life history traits, but we're just a 100 level class, so we're just scratching the surface. The age of the first reproduction, the frequency of reproduction, the number of offspring, and the amount of parental care given. Actually, that last bullet point I didn't bring up, so that's a good one too. So all those things are what's considered. And again, going back to the examples I used before, how is this practical for people, for us? where we talk about fisheries and DNR, who sets laws and rules for hunting. These are all the kinds of things they have to consider to make sure that people aren't killing animals, in that example, at the wrong time, at the wrong place, things like that. Still got a little bit more to say about this, but does anybody have any questions about this slide? All right. Obviously, as you already know from the previous chapter, reproductive success is key to evolutionary success, right? So it's not, again, survival of the fittest. Because just surviving doesn't matter as far as evolution is concerned. You have to be able to reproduce. So it's the combination of life history traits that represents the trade-off which balance the demands for reproduction and survival. Again, thinking about type 1 versus type 3. It's a trade-off, right? So type 1's like, all right, I'm not going to have a bunch of kids. Or offspring. I'm only going to have a few, but I'm going to make sure I really take care of these few to make sure they survive, right? Meanwhile, type 3, it's kind of the opposite. We're like, you know what? I'm not going to give these things any care, so I'm going to make a bunch of offspring, just hoping some of them will survive, right? So it's a trade-off. And of course, type 2 is right there in between. And as you might imagine, even though this textbook doesn't get into it, because again, this is a 100 level class, technically there's, it's not just like they're all type 3, all exactly type 1, 2, or all exactly type 1. Sometimes there's kind of in between, right? So nothing's exact, but this is just how we study. These are models, I guess you could say. But also because selective pressures vary, right? Natural selection, right? Life histories are very diverse. Basically what I was getting at. Any questions about that slide?
What do you mean by life histories are diverse?
So, like what we're
They're
talking
not
about.
all the same?
No, like going back here, when we talk about this life history, right, with the diverse, right? So typically humans can reproduce, we don't anymore, thank goodness, but typically humans can reproduce at age 13, right? The dog can't. The dog probably reproduce at age 2. I don't know the numbers, but think about like all the different species you can think of. Think about like when they can first start reproducing.
Oh.
And then how often they have offspring. And then when they have offspring, how many do they have at once? And how much care do they give? That's what I mean by,
Okay.
yeah. That's what I mean by the diverse. It's so many different ways of doing that. It's a good question. So with all this in mind, there's 2 more terms you need to know for the exam. It's basically describing the same thing, but in a slightly different way. The first one is called an opportunistic life history. Opportunistic life histories take immediate advantage of favorable conditions. But more importantly, as far as the exam is concerned anyway, the better way to remember it is typically exhibits a type 3 survivorship curve. So again, like I said earlier, and I'm glad he asked, there's all these different types of life histories, right? Just think about all these different species and all the different ways they reproduce. Now we're categorizing them. There's a particular group called opportunistic life history, typically type 3, and yes, they take advantage of favorable conditions. Also, let me point this out. This bullet point is an abbreviated bullet point when you think about it. I could have described type 3 again, but I didn't. So we're talking about opportunistic life history. We're talking about many offspring. We're talking about poor care. We're talking about low survivorship for the young, right? All those things that we've already used to describe type 3 survivorship. That's an opportunistic life history. And what I mean by taking immediate advantage of favorable conditions, this is a good example. It's a dandelion. I'm sure you've seen, like in the spring, your yard looks normal. There's no flowers out there. And then like 1 day, 2 days later, boom, you've got dandelions all over the place. And then like a week later, they're gone, right? Because their life history allows them to just kind of hang out. And then once things are good for reproduction, they take advantage of it. And I like this picture because, again, every one of these little things, when you blow on it and it floats away, every single one of those things is an offspring, right? That's what seeds are. Those are offspring. So one dandelion has hundreds of offspring. Most of them won't make it, but they balance that out by producing a bunch. Like, all right, I'm hedging my bets and putting a bunch of them out there. Surely some of them will make it. And again, very little care, right? Once those seeds go away, look how small those seeds are. There's very few there's not much nutrition in there. And remember, that's what seeds are for. Seeds also provide nutrition for the offspring. So if you have tiny little seeds, it's very little protection, very little nutrition to help them grow, right? So again, it's hedging their bets. Instead of producing a few seeds, few bigger seeds that are well protected and have lots of nutrients, they hedge their bets and like, I'm just going to produce a bunch, just put them out there. Hope some of them survive. So any questions about opportunistic life history? All right, so there's only one more you need to know about for the exam, and it's the opposite of opportunistic life history. It's called equilibrial life history, and that's us. And in a sense, these two, I didn't even need to write those two. Those 2 bullet points right here, I could have just written type 1 survivorship, right? Just like I did on that earlier slide. Instead of listing out all the type 3 survivorships, I just said, hey, type 3 survivorship. So equilibrial life history, these organisms typically exhibit a type 1 survivorship, which again, reach sexual maturity slowly. Actually, I didn't mention that earlier. So yeah, that is new information for you guys. They reach sexual maturity relatively slowly. They produce few well cared for offspring. Actually, the word relative should be in all that. Relatively few, relatively well cared for. And of course, some more information here. They're typically larger bodied and longer lived. Now that I think about it, I really, again, should edit this PowerPoint because in the previous slide, I should have included that information to say for opportunistic life history, they are typically smaller bodied and shorter lived, right? And again, we have already taken care of this. Exhibits a type 1 survivorship. So if you can just remember that opportunistic life history and equilibrial life history are opposites, hopefully that'll help you remember. And hopefully if you can remember, opportunistic life histories typically exhibit a type 3 survivorship curve, and equilibrial life histories typically exhibit a type 1 survivorship curve. Hopefully that can help you remember all this. And these are great examples, right? So I showed you a dandelion in the previous slide. That's a plant, but look at this plant, right? Compare that to a palm tree. Palm trees are much larger. They live much longer. Look at those seeds. Each one of those coconuts is a seed. That's a big old thing. Imagine that thing's bigger than a dandelion itself. So they produce, I mean, it looks like a lot. You look at a coconut, man, it's a lot of coconuts. But it's not compared to a dandelion, right? They produce, instead of putting all their energy and resources into a bunch of seeds, they take the same amount of energy and resources that they would take to make a bunch of small seeds, and they took that and they made fewer large seeds. And those seeds are better protected. And this is a weird thing. People don't think about this for plants, but this well cared for. That makes sense with animals, right? You think of like how a human takes care of their babies versus how a crocodile lays eggs and leaves them, right? But plants do the same thing. We just don't think about it like this. So those coconuts are well cared for offspring because they're large. There's a lot of nutrients. They even have milk in there. It's not, they call it milk, but it's basically water. You know, they've got liquid in there. They float, so they can go from island to island, right? Those seeds, those offspring are well cared for as far as the plant kingdom is concerned. And of course, like I said earlier, when we think about animals, it's pretty common sense, right? They give an elephant. An elephant has a 22-month gestation period, I think, right? So they're pregnant for over a year, almost 2 years. So that's well cared for. And then when they're born, and the elephant mama's not just like, all right, see you later. Matter of fact, if I remember correctly, the father and the mother both take care of the offspring. So very well cared for offspring. And again, when we talk about an elephant, that's a type 1. That's an opportunistic, equilibrial example. And then think about something like, again, I don't know, a rat or a rabbit. Rabbits, like, of course they nurse their young. But anyway, again, typically larger body, longer living, slower for sexual maturity, well cared for offspring. Anyway, any questions about that slide? Okay, the next word for attendance, pay attention, I'm changing it up a little. Instead of a coconut being the next word of attendance, just put where, what do you think of when you think of coconuts? Like where? Whether it be a specific place, like I think of Chicago, Ohio, which I wouldn't. Or I said Chicago, Ohio, agree. Chicago, Illinois, right? You can get specific and name a place, or it could just be something in general, like, oh, I think of the snow-capped mountains. Again, bad example, right? So whatever it is you think of when you think of coconuts, that's the next word for attendance. It comes to places. All right, this next slide is a table from, I believe it was the old textbook, but I included it for you. This is good for studying, right? So it's, again, comparing opportunistic versus equilibrium. Like the climate they live in, for opportunistic, it's relatively unpredictable, which makes sense because, like I said, they like to take advantage of of situations. So they kind of hang out and do their own thing when things aren't good. But because the climate is unpredictable, then once it does become good, they have to take advantage of it quickly because it could, go bad again, right? Unlike for equilibrium, they live in relatively predictable climates. Maturation time, like how long does it take to become mature? Again, short for equilibrium, short for opportunistic, long for equilibrium. Lifespan, again, relatively short for opportunistic, relatively long for equilibrium. Death rate, I don't like that because that's not specific enough. It should say death rate for the young, often high. Death rate for the young for equilibrium, usually low. Number of offspring per reproductive episode. There's a lot for opportunistic, few for equilibrium. But anyway, you can read that. Everything we said is on the table there. It's easy to read, really good to study. And again, I don't think it's in your textbook. I'm pretty positive this is from my old textbook or the old textbook. But anyway, if you can't find it in the textbook and you want to study it, download the PowerPoint. There it is. So that's it for life histories. Are there any questions about life histories? All right. So like I said, Monday, that's just one of the things we look at. Another thing, one of the big things we look at when we talk about population ecology. Remember, population ecology, to remind you, is all about looking at how a population changes, how it grows, how it shrinks, and the things that cause it to grow and shrink, right? Therefore, now we're going to talk about population growth models. So first we just talked about, or we just got finished talking about all these different models of like life histories, right? Now we're talking about population growth models. And I'll go ahead and tell you before we start for the exam, you're going to need to know the difference between exponential and logistic. So as I'm teaching those things, think about that. That's how the questions are going to go for the exam. I'm going to give you I'm going to describe something, and you're going to tell me if it's exponential or logistic. Actually, same with the stuff we mentioned earlier. I should have said that, I'm sorry. So when it comes to opportunistic versus equilibrium, I'm going to describe some scenario when you tell, and I'm going to ask you, is it, opportunistic or equilibrium? And also, here's a big hint. Those are the only two correct answers for those questions. But then there's also going to be junk answers. So as long as you can guess one of the two proper answers, you'll at least get partial credit if you get it wrong. But if you guess one of the junk answers, you get 0 credit. Same here. When I start asking questions about population growth models, the only two possible correct answers are going to be exponential or logistic. And there's going to be some other choices that make absolutely no sense. If you guess the wrong one, but at least it's one of these two, you'll get partial credit. If you guess one of my junk questions, you'll get 0 credit for that question. Anyway, let's jump into it. As you already know, population size fluctuates. What causes them to fluctuate? You probably already know this, but they can increase as individuals are born or individuals move into an area, or the population size can decrease as individuals die or move out, right? Common sense, you already know that. That's what causes the population size to fluctuate. So these models that I'm going to teach you, they investigate how the sizes of the populations may change over time under different conditions. In other words, the better way of saying this is, hopefully you probably picked this up by now. Biologists just like to categorize things, right? So we look at how life works and we start categorizing. These people, this group of organisms, that's opportunistic. This is equilibrium. Same thing here, right? Now we're going to look at how population size changes amongst different organisms, and we're categorizing it, right? We've put it into 2 different categories. So here we go. The first one is called exponential growth. Exponential population growth. And you're going to need to know this. Again, I'm going to give you an example of this, and then you'll have to recognize it as exponential or logistic. And maybe I'll ask you the definition, but probably not. Here we go. Exponential growth. It's the expansion in an ideal and unlimited environment. That's the definition. At least that's the definition that your book gave you. And once again, I'll remind you for independent work, an easy 1 point. Anything I tell you here, question it. Question me, question your textbook. You said that the exponential growth is an expansion in ideal and unlimited environment. I looked it up, and according to this source, they define it as, boom, what will they put? Anyway, the population size of each new generation is calculated by multiplying the current population by a constant factor that represents the birth rate minus the death rate. I'm definitely not going to ask you anything from that bullet point, but it is good to know. Like, for example, I think the human growth rate right now is, I don't know, I really am just guessing, 1.5 worldwide maybe? So that means to figure out how many we're going to have in the next generation, you take how many we have now, and you multiply it by that growth rate. So right now we have about 8 billion, so you take 8 billion, multiply it by around 1.5, and that's how many we should have in about one generation. And that's not just for humans, right? That's for anything. That's what we do. That's what biologists do. They figure out the growth rate. Like, all right, if the population size is this in this generation, then it's going to be this in the next generation because we're going to multiply it by this birth rate, or, by this constant right here. Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit more about it. Are there any questions so far? And maybe now that I think about it, maybe I should have mentioned humans as an example because, again, we're talking about exponential population growth. So in exponential population growth, humans are a horrible example. Well, actually, that's a conversation we'll have later. You could argue one or the other for humans, but anyway, exponential population growth, expansion in an ideal and unlimited environment. And I included that picture of bacteria because that's how bacteria reproduce, right? They reproduce quickly, right? They just double, 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 double. Anyway, this accelerating growth rate produces a J-shaped curve. That will definitely be a test question. And what I mean by that is I'm going to show you a graph that shows the population growth rate of exponential growth. And then, of course, I'm going to show you one of logistic growth. So the question on the exam will ask you to describe the graph. If it's a J-shaped curve, that means it is exponential. And that'll make more sense when I show you the picture on the next slide. So the slope shows how rapidly the population is growing. That'll make more sense when I show you a picture on the next slide. And it is common in certain situations following a disturbance, which I'm going to teach you about later. But disturbance, for now, we'll just call it something that messes things up temporarily. A fire, a flood, a hurricane, a drought, a cold snap. Basically something that kills off a lot of stuff in an area, that's a disturbance. And of course, if a lot of stuff dies, then all of a sudden you've got this opportunity. You've got all these resources. So anything that did survive, and it's got all these resources and no competition, and maybe no predators, right? It can just multiply. And that would be exponential growth. This will not be a question necessarily, but again, if I'm giving you an example and you have to determine whether it's exponential or logistic, some of this information might be in my example. I might say something like, there was a hurricane that hit an island off the coast, off of the Florida Keys, and it killed almost everything on the island. And then I have to discuss how rapidly the population of mangroves grew. And it had a J-shaped curve. And I give you all that information. You say, oh yeah, that's the exponential growth. So really quickly, here's the graph I'm talking about. There's the J-shaped curve, right? It's kind of got a J shape. And like I said previously, in that previous slide, the slope tells you how rapidly it's growing. So for example, let's say this is population B, and then there was another population, and their graph was like this. Let's call that population A. And then there was another population, and it grew like this, and that's population C. Now that's all exponential growth, right? Those are all exponential. Those are all J-shaped curves. Now, which one of those populations had a faster growth rate, A, B, or C?
A.
Good, A, right? That's what I mean by the slope indicates how quickly the population is growing. And that might be a test question too. I might give you a graph like this and say, which one had the higher population growth rate, which would be A, or which one had the lowest population growth rate, which would be C. So again, that's exponential growth. Any questions about exponential growth? All right, the next word for attendance will be rabbit. Rabbit is the next word for attendance. And again, if you're online, don't forget to send the words. So many people who log in and then don't send the words. I don't know why. Anyway, logistic growth population. See, we've got less than 2 minutes. I'll introduce you to this topic, and when I come back on Friday, we'll finish it. So, like we said, and the previous discussion was exponential growth. But if you remember, the definition of exponential growth said it was a growth in an ideal and unlimited environment. But most environments are not unlimited. And technically, and you don't even know this for the exam, but technically, there is no such thing as an unlimited environment. Everything is finite, right? Energy is finite, resources are finite. So technically, nothing is really unlimited. But anyway, so what we have to deal with when it comes to logistic growth models are something called limiting factors. And you definitely need to know what a limiting factor is. This is something that will be talked about later in this chapter and in the next chapter. So even though it's important for this specific topic, it's going to be important again later. So you need to know what they are. Limiting factors are environmental factors that restrict population growth. Like we said at the beginning of the chapter, population ecology is concerned with how populations grow or shrink and what causes that growth or shrink. That's what we said earlier, and now I'm giving a term for that, for what I said earlier. Those things are called limiting factors. The living and non-living things that affect the population's growth rate, those are limiting factors. And those are the things that control the number of individuals that they can occupy a habitat. So the last word for attendance, we won't do the last word, that's enough. All right, so we're done. We'll talk more about this on Friday. Again, I'll be online for lab if you need me, but I will not be in this room. And don't forget, you have to be here 2 weeks from today. We will not have an online meeting 2 weeks today. It's in person only.